Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Equals, the fantastic podcast about inequality. My name's Max, and today, at least for the intro and the bit at the end of the podcast, you've just got me because we did this interview today, me and Nafkote, my co-host, but she's on maternity leave. So whilst you'll hear her in the interview, you'll just hear me this beginning and the end. It's an amazing interview. It's the second of a kind of two-part mini-series on kind of two amazing plans, visions, if you like, for a more just and sustainable future that were published very recently. First of all was the roadmap looking beyond growth, and that interview was with Olivier de Schutter, who led that process with many hundreds of different organizations. That was the last podcast, really worth listening to. And this is the second one with three of the amazing team behind the Global Justice Report that was published by the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics recently. We're going to hear from Cornelia Mohren, known as Nelly, Anmol Somanchi, and Moritz Odersky. And we spoke to them recently about the report, their kind of view on different aspects of it. And it was a great interview. They're full of energy and full of enthusiasm and had some great answers. So I hope you enjoy the interview.
Anmol, Moritz, and Nelly, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, huge congratulations launching the Global Justice Report. It's a massive piece of work. Before we dive into the details, I would love to start with the why now? What made this the right moment for a report like this? And what are the headline findings?
Firstly, thanks a lot for having us and really looking forward to this conversation. Maybe I'll start by saying what are the main findings, and then I'll maybe try and give a sense of why we think this is the right time for a report like this. So I think the central sort of message that we're trying to put forward in the report is a new vision for global progress in the 21st century, one that grounds planetary habitability and prosperity in human development and equality. And I think these are usually goals that are sometimes stated independently, whereas what we do in this report is to bring them all together in a coherent sort of framework. And the main sort of point that we're trying to make is that it is possible to achieve shared prosperity at the global level while still maintaining planetary habitability. So the central scenario that we lay out in the report is one where per capita incomes in all countries in the world would converge to something like 5,000 euros per month, and we would still be able to retain temperature rise to about 1.8 degrees. But as we highlight, if we want to achieve this ambitious goal, we would need three pillars to this sort of transition. First one is a rapid decarbonization of energy systems, which means expansion of electrification and a full phase out of fossil fuels. The second is what we call sufficiency in the report, which itself has three broad elements. The first one is essentially some sort of growth caps in the very rich countries, partly driven by reduction in labor hours, so how much time people spend working. The second element is basically a shift of consumption and production away from materially and carbon intensive sectors like manufacturing, for instance, towards more immaterial sectors like health, education, and other services. And the third aspect of sufficiency is a change in food habits, particularly in Europe and North America, where red meat consumption, for instance, is very high, which would allow us to change land use patterns and reduce the amount of land that is used for grazing and instead increase forest cover at the global level. And the third pillar is compression of inequality within countries as well, both in order to finance, the large sums of money that we would need for this kind of ambitious transition, but also to ensure that incomes for those at the middle and lower parts of the income distribution continue to grow, even if these countries in the global north at the aggregate are not growing so much. And as to why we think this is a good time, well, we're constantly of late being fed a sort of techno-dystopian nationalist narrative about what's going to happen in the future. People are already thinking about invading Mars, about, building bunkers in the North and the South Pole. And these clearly have a certain are one way of thinking about the future. Whereas we think at some point we will need to think about an alternative future that is more equal, that is more just. And we hope that this sort of report can provide a sort of moral compass for policymakers, for citizens, for unions, and more generally for people to think and debate on what kind of future do we want? And the further we keep delaying this, it's going to be harder to have something concrete to build on.
An additional objective of the report is also to really think social and environmental questions together, in the sense of who's causing environmental damage, who's benefiting from destruction of the environment, and who's suffering from the impacts of global warming. At the same time, who has capacity to act, and it's the rich people, it's the wealthy people who have the power to shape the transition, because they have the funds, they have the money to invest in adaptation and mitigation. And of course, we argue that these capacities should be socialized, that there has to be a restructuring of wealth inequality, income inequality, and it shouldn't be in the hands of the ultra rich to determine the conditions and the speed at which this happens. But this should really be a public endeavor that includes all parts of the population, in particular those that are not responsible for the crisis and that are those who are suffering the most.
On a similar issue, and we've had debates, similar debates inside Oxfam, is that sometimes, if I'm honest, it's been quite hard to convince my climate colleagues who care more about kind of degrowth and the planet than they do about social justice, and making the case to them that, these things are so intimately linked to inequality is something that the report really does. But you do stop short in the report of coming out in favour of full degrowth. You have this concept of sufficiency, but what were the debates around that? The kind of the sense in which, we do still need to grow quite significant parts of the global north economy was one message. And also, I think it was very powerful about the global south. Maybe you could say something about those kind of growth debates within the report.
I think there was partly a deliberate approach. So we really didn't want to directly put us in a green growth or degrowth corner there, but we wanted to start from like a clean sheet, especially because we believe that sometimes the wording shields a lot of like commonalities there. So I think if you actually talk to degrowth people, they are often like reduced to the headline of like they want to limit the economy, but they also speak of like growing substantially the economies of the global south, as well as also in the global north certain sectors, such as like the care economy. So we deliberately stayed away from this degrowth approach and more ask, what do we believe kind of do people need for prosperity for all?
There was also the fact that it's a bit hard to have a very serious conversation about sustainable climate futures without acknowledging the very legitimate aspiration of countries in the global south to achieve the levels of prosperity that many of the rich countries have achieved today. And so we felt that we have to start by taking that aspiration seriously, and then to see, well, if we take that aspiration seriously, what are the conditions that we would need, technical, social, with regards to the energy system, with regards to inequality, that would make these two objectives of prosperity and climate sustainability compatible. And I think that was also the motivation for, in a sense, still having a focus on growth, because, the moment we start neglecting that, it becomes a bit harder to convince, citizens in the global south that this is something that they should also care for as much.
No, I can see that, definitely. We were a bit upset, to be honest, because you were more radical than Oxfam, and we felt kind of outcompeted. So, your proposals for wealth taxation and what it would do to billionaires were really, really amazing. So tell us a bit about that and then how that money would be used. Maybe Nelly, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes. I mean, so basically what we found in our modeling process is, of course, that we need to raise a lot of funds at the global level in order to, on the one hand, invest into climate mitigation. There's estimates of 3 to 4% of global GDP, which have to flow into investments in low carbon infrastructure and so on. And of course, investments in education and health, etc., in order to stimulate the catch-up of today's poorer countries. And so the question is, where does this money come from? And our answer is it should come from the global rich. And this is why we suggest the creation of a new institution, which we call the Global Justice Fund, which would collect revenues from, on the one hand, the global wealth tax, and on the other hand, the global income tax. And the idea would be that the size of this fund is at about 10% of global GDP in the beginning, and is then used in order to distribute per capita country dividends that would be used for sustainable investments. And so, as you mentioned, we're quite radical in some sense. So we're suggesting that the wealth tax would rise to up to 20% for billionaires, income taxes of up to 90% for people who earn more than 110 million euros, which is 5,000 times the average income at the global level, which ultimately would lead to an eradication of the billionaire class. So we project, of course, a large decrease in the share of the ultra rich just because we're taxing their income and their wealth. And so what we are arguing is that we need the mobilization of many people in society to support these kind of policies and to make them understand that actually it's only a minority of people which would lose, and these are the people who have a lot of power and control over political decision processes today.
I think for most of us, it's clear what these solutions are, meaning, Nelly, you already talked about taxing billionaires and then shrinking the global wealth gap. But, when I talk to people, it really makes me realize we live in a society that's conditioned to believe that endless growth and maximizing profit is the only way forward. So how do we even begin to shift that collective mindset? How do we convince people to value time and planetary health over rising GDP?
So I think first, and that's what we did at the World Inequality Lab and you at Oxfam for decades, is like educating people about these stark inequalities, right? Like typically if you go out and talk to people and you face them with these numbers of like how large the wealth or income gaps are currently, they typically underestimate them. And that extends to inequality of opportunity and other dimensions of inequality. So that's of course the first part, and that's what we engaged in for a long time now. But we believe that like showing only how bad the situation is not enough. And that's exactly kind of our approach here, like moving to a more optimistic vision, basically offering a vision of like quantifying how the life could be better for the more than 90%. And then on top of that comes, of course, the benefits of preventing a climate crisis, having much more leisure time actually that we envision as labor hours are reduced. And there again, I think it starts with educating, and I don't think people don't know this. So typically if you ask, for example, if you look at polls, people are in favor of like higher wealth taxation and so on. And personally, they often do value leisure. There's demand for a shorter work week and so. And I think it's really about like showing that this is politically possible. And then, of course, it's in the end a cultural and political battle or debate. And Nelly already hinted at, of course, the ones who are resisting this are the ones at benefiting from the system currently. And those have outproportional power compared to how many people there are. As we all know, they disproportionately fund kind of donations for politicians. They own media in many countries. And that, of course, makes it very easy that this large proportion of the people gets a large voice. And I think we really need to kind of enter this battle and enter it with a positive vision also. And not only with saying, oh, everything is shit, if I may say, but also kind of offering credible path forward how it might be better for people. And now our proposal is really macro and like very much on a global level. And I think there's much more work to do to bring this on the more local level and really engaging with how this might change the living conditions and realities of people. And I think that's an exciting path forward. And we also hope to work more on that.
I have a kind of follow-up to that, Moritz, and I agree with you completely. Okay, here's a challenge. So another adjacent hero of this work is Gabriel Zucman and what he's pushing for around the world. And his proposal is very moderate in many ways. Just a 2% total wealth tax. You guys are pushing now for like 20%, and you saw the pushback you got in France from those super rich people and the way they can shift the debate in places like Denmark really rapidly. And, we also constantly fighting on the same terrain with you guys. So were there any discussions, there's the kind of two different theories of change here. There's one where you say, right, let's have a moderate proposal that sounds very reasonable, a kind of low rate, how could you disagree with 2%? Or you have a kind of, this is our positive vision for what is needed, which is a world without billionaires. And they've both got arguments in favor of each approach. I'm just curious, given we're now seeing both approaches emerging out of you brilliant people, what was the debate around that as you were putting the report together?
So I think there's complementarities, and we indeed had debates with that. I actually talked with Gabriel Zucman on this, and he's also convinced of this, that of course our vision here in the Global Justice Report is much more a long-term view. It's nothing that is implementable realistically this year or next year, but there's a lot of coalition building going before that, and also of course intermediate steps. And for example, the G20 International Tax Initiative and many other initiatives that you champion, or other also, especially like countries of the Global South, like the Bridgetown Initiative, that's of course intermediary steps. We will not go from zero international wealth taxation to 20% of the billionaire, but there's a clear like step by step and also like hopefully materializing benefits for lower income and middle income people that helps of course in convincing them that this is the right path forward and actually brings benefits to them. And then we can get to a world where we see here. And on the same hand, due to the climate crisis, we of course know that this needs to go quick and we need to act. And therefore I think maybe we should push all these theories of change.
I completely agree.
If I can add on that, some people might even say that our plan is not sufficient sufficiently radical, because in the end, it still takes us until the end of the century to have equal per capita incomes. We still envision some within country inequality by the end of the century. So this catch-up process goes over many decades. And if we look, for example, at historical damages, if we think about colonialism, if we think about climate responsibilities, etc., one might even argue that we have to go further and that we have to send much more reparations, for example, from global north to the global south as of today. And we can't wait for convergence that happens over the next 75 years.
It's a great point, Nelly.
So in terms of pushback, my concern is not, to be honest, the super rich. Given the political reality right now, a core narrative of the far right is that living standards are plummeting because of out-of-touch progressives are introducing climate policies that will make regular people poorer. And given how radical your proposals are, you must be anticipating some major pushback again, from the far right, which is on the rise. So how do you plan to counter that narrative and win over a public that might be fearful of such massive change?
I think this goes back partly to the point that Nelly made earlier, which is that oftentimes climate policy has come with this sort of classless ecology type of approach where we think we can address, environmental issues without addressing entrenched, power, wealth, and income inequalities. And so I think part of the story is to take the concerns of the average citizens more seriously. So if we impose sustainable policies that are going to ultimately hurt those at the bottom without necessarily hurting those at the top, it's going to be really hard to convince the majorities to take forward these kinds of approaches. So I think that's number one. The second is, I think, this is a battle of narratives at the end of the day. I think our report kind of lays out quite clearly that majorities across the world would benefit from such an approach. And yet, I think those, from the right wing, those that are, benefiting from the current global economic system we're already seeing pushback. People are calling us Stalinist. People are calling the report completely out of touch from reality. There's all kinds of pushback that we're getting. And I think our approach so far, but also, we hope in the future, is to keep coming back and highlighting that the current status quo is really to the benefit of very few. Well, of course, there are serious environmental implications of this kind of, materialistic, productivistic, economic models that we are following. But there's also sort of greater risks to our democratic systems. And I think, we have to constantly keep fighting the narrative, constantly keep reminding people of the benefits that come from a more fair, a more just, a more democratic world, and a world that is more livable. Europe is going through one of its worst heat waves. And I think, nobody can deny that it's really terrible. With the kind of, everyone's barely able to sleep at night and things like that. So these are very real problems. Climate change is no more just some abstract concept that people should be thinking about. So I think part of it is to relate these to everyday troubles that people face and to keep bringing the narrative back to all the positives that come from a more fair, just, equitable world.
Yeah, yes, and I think if we think about concrete climate policies, we also, as Anmol said, we have to make sure that the social is always included, the social perspective. And of course, if we talk about increasing fuel prices, this will create opposition, because some people depend on cars and they pay a relatively large share of their income on fuel, and it has a huge impact, a huge regressive impact if we talk about carbon taxes, etc. So we have to think about other policies like expansion of public infrastructure, giving people access to organic food, to food with good quality, change prices of goods so that it becomes accessible for everyone to live a more sustainable, a more conscious lifestyle, rather than blaming people to use their car who are potentially dependent on the car because they live on the countryside and so on. So we have to ban private jets. We have to ban the luxury consumption of the very rich in the very first place before we hit on the poorest who are dependent on some energy-intensive consumption.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think bringing class back into the climate debate is vital. Coming back to this issue of kind of radicalism and maybe not too radical, certainly what you're proposing on wealth is that by 2100 we'll be back where we were in 1980. So kind of 1/3 of global wealth will be broadly under public control, which is radical in contrast to where we are. But in another way, it's just taking us back to where we were in 1980. And 2/3 of global wealth would still be in the hands of, in private hands, that's still fairly capitalist, isn't it? So did you have those debates as well? Is what you're proposing, I mean, as Anmol, you've been accused by your critics of being kind of full-on Stalinist communist, but really you're not really calling for that at all. So was there a discussion in the team writing the report about capitalism itself? And maybe that is the ultimate problem. So it's not a kind of reshaping of capitalism, but the system in itself that's fundamentally flawed? Because you certainly haven't come out as anti-capitalist, I think. Is that fair to say?
So on the question of how radical this is, I think in many regards we go further than the 1980s were. So you were specifically referring to how wealth is controlled and that the public share would be 1/3 and the private share of wealth would still be 2/3. But we also model the complete private distribution of wealth, and there we go much further. So actually looking at most part of the 20th century, the bottom 50% of people had close to zero, or today it's around 3% of wealth in the world. And we envision this to rise to 28%. So the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution would control almost 1/3 of total private wealth. So we are not abolishing private wealth here at all, and thereby we don't necessarily focus on transcending capitalism and saying we would bring all production under state control, but we envision for sure that the private wealth will be controlled very differently by different people. And then if we want to transcend capitalism, we believe that there are sectors which perform better under public control, such as health and education, but we surely don't envision that all of production and should go under public control. And if you then in the end say that, okay, once we provide certain public infrastructure as well as public education and health, this is now a new democratic socialism, then okay, great. If you say that's not capitalism anymore, that's great. But I think it's clearly we want to stay much more practical on how kind of our society would look like and how people's lives would look like. And the term that we put on that doesn't matter so much, and we certainly but that's pretty much clear, don't want to go back to any form of 20th century communism or something, but we feel like there must be something better in the future, and we try to start a conversation on envisioning that, and it's surely not done, and we hope that people chip in this, and there's more work going forward on this.
What gives you hope that the world is able and ready to make these necessary course corrections?
If I may start, and kind of in the tradition of how we are working at the World Inequality Lab, we love to take a very long run perspective. So we used to do this a lot in looking back at history, and now for the first time kind of into the future. That was, for example, highlighted in Thomas Piketty's book, A Brief History of Equality. If we really take a long run stance and we go back to starting to look at like the 18th century until today, we've seen a big movement over time to more justice, more equality on the income and wealth distribution, but also on many other dimensions such as gender equality. But I believe that overall there's a movement of humanity and justice, and there's no reason why this should now reverse and go back. And I believe we can go back on this track. So kind of looking back at history can also give hope for the future.
Maybe to add on that, I mean, we see a lot of initiatives, a lot of activist groups, a lot of civil society movements that are already pushing for a more just and more sustainable future. So both in the global north and in the global south, I think we've mentioned some throughout this podcast already. But for example, the Bridgetown Initiative that asks for reform, we haven't talked that much about it, but of the international financial architecture that we discuss in the report, which is deeply unjust and tailored towards rich countries today. If we think about G20 initiatives of Brazil and South Africa, the idea to create an international panel on inequality, the UN Tax Convention process. So these are all great initiatives that are born not only by policymakers, but also by civil society. I think Moritz in the beginning has quoted some research of researchers associated to our lab who shows that actually in all countries, even in countries like the US, there is a support for coordinated global climate action and for redistribution of wealth at the global scale. So, for example, a majority for a global wealth tax of 2% that would then be earmarked to fund development in low-income countries. So we feel that there is actually a demand, and what we try to provide is the narrative or a more systemic view of what a just and sustainable future could look like. But yeah, we're already seeing that many people are worried and concerned about these questions. Same for climate question. We see many young people worried about climate crisis and social questions. And the question is on how to coordinate the movement towards a more just future.
I'll just add one thing, which is to say, I mean, we don't think any of this is going to happen tomorrow, but at the same time, we think, there's a lot of pressure for increasing economic and social social justice and environmental justice across the world. And the central aim of this report was to sort of provide a contribution to this discussion by providing a quantified pathway for the rest of the century. And this is one pathway which comes with a certain set of benefits. There are potentially other pathways, but it's high time that we have a democratic collective deliberation on these very key issues. We can't leave this just to a set of handful of experts who tell us what the world should look like, in the next few decades. And time is at crunch now with the climate crisis really looming over us very soon. And so the point was to lay out a sort of narrative and backed by a sort of fairly quantified, well thought out, systematic approach to model these different dimensions. And we just hope that this can sort of open the door to newer conversations, to thinking about alternative economic, social, environmental models. And if we can achieve that, I think we've already made a good start.
I agree. I think if you want people to hope, then they have to have something to hope for, and not just know what they're against, but know what they're for. And I think it's just in that sense, you're helping build hope by offering such a clear and practical contribution. So you've done a brilliant job, guys. Brilliant job.
Thanks a lot for having us, and thanks for all the inspiring work that Oxfam does. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that was a great interview. What a dynamic group of people. Must have been a lot of fun working on this report. You get the sense that they really, really did some great work together. It's such a good report, really worth reading. I think there's a couple of things, I won't say much, but that really stand out for me about this report. I think the primary thing is the way that they bring together the kind of twin aims, if you like, of planetary survival, living, not survival, just a planetary thriving, and also the desire to see an end to poverty and prosperity for everyone on Earth. And the fundamental key to all of that, to achieving those two aims, is a huge reduction in inequality. They do talk about significant growth in the overall level of the economy over time, but primarily this is about redistribution between North and South and within countries too. And that if we do manage to radically reduce inequality, we can deliver prosperity for everybody whilst staying within 1.5 degrees and stopping climate breakdown. And that is an incredibly important message to get across, because sometimes I think people associate, or they don't say this in the interview, they say they're kind of two parallel aims, but I would say often they're seen as conflicting. The idea is that the only way that we can save the planet is for the majority of people to somehow stay poor. And I think they're very clear that that is not a trade-off that we need to make. So I think that's really powerful on its own. But there's so much more in there that's worth looking at. And as they said in the interview, so much to talk about. They were really, really clever the way they looked at kind of how growth itself will shift away from kind of polluting sectors and into more kind of non-polluting but incredibly important sectors like education and healthcare, and how those areas of the economy really need to grow, and how those areas of the economy are much, much lower carbon, particularly if they're public. If you think about public healthcare, basically, if healthcare, as an example, if healthcare is private, as it is in the US, then everybody needs to earn more money in order to pay for their own healthcare. It's incredibly inefficient. So your economy needs to be much bigger to deliver the same level of healthcare for everybody. Whereas if it's public and universal, everyone can earn less, and that means a smaller economy, a less carbon intensive economy, but they have exactly the same, if not better healthcare, longer life expectancy, happier lives. All of these things are possible at much, much lower carbon footprints. I think that's a very important argument they make too. Is this socialism? Well, in a very important way, it's not. They envision a big role for private wealth way into the future. This isn't about all wealth suddenly being taken by the government or anything. Absolutely not. But they envisioned like 2/3 of all wealth would still be in private hands. But as I think Nelly said in the interview, those private hands would be completely different to today. At the moment, almost all wealth is in the hands of a tiny group of people, whereas their vision for the future, a core part of it is the democratization of private wealth, if you like. So, private wealth would be spread across everyone on the planet. That would involve, the poorest half of humanity having far, far more wealth than they do at the moment. And also it would envision an end to the billionaire class, an end to the super rich, something that I think would be a good thing for everybody. So yeah, democratization of private wealth, but certainly not a nationalization of private wealth. But they do see a much bigger role for government too. So 1/3 of all total wealth would be in the public sphere, so kind of controlled democratically by governments. But again, that's not super radical. That would take us back to where we were in the 1980s. You've seen this steady erosion of public wealth through privatizations, through public debt being taken on. So that what they want to do is reverse that and have more public wealth, which is very important because public wealth can be deployed and invested in ways that are not entirely driven by profit, and that's key if we want to kind of build a more equal future. I could talk all day. I'm not going to. I think this report is brilliant. Do have a read. It's short, it's very well written, and it's very inspiring. And together with Olivier's roadmap beyond growth, these are two really powerful visions for a future. And we really need to seize control of what a better future could look like and define that for everybody. It's not enough to explain how awful the vision is of the, tech moguls of colonizing Mars and, an AI-driven future. We need to have our own version of how the world could be a much better place. And I think these two reports really help with that. So have a read. We're going to be off air now until September. We're taking a break, and then we're going to come back with our new season of Equals. We've got lots of amazing guests lined up. It's going to be really cool. So we'll see you all back then. Please recommend us to your friends. Take the time over the summer, maybe listen to some of the older episodes. We interviewed Piketty himself, for instance, just before Christmas, and lots of amazing interviews over the last few years with some great thinkers and amazing activists. So do have a look back through that trove, and we will be back on air in September and look forward to talking to you then. Thanks very much, everyone.